There's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture.
You like me right now. You like me.
Ever since I was a little kid, I wanted this.
Mom, I just want an Oscar.
I'm Connor Wold, and welcome back to another episode of the Ultimate Oscars Showdown. And this week we are once again tier ranking the Best Picture winners, but this week we are going to be looking at the decade of the 1980s. We are now in our 4th episode. You guys have been showing a lot of support, so please do keep that up. Comment below, let me know your rankings, like the video, all that stuff really helps the channel and is the reason why I built this channel, to build a great Oscar community, a great film loving community. So your support is definitely and always appreciated, so please do keep that up. But continuing on, we've done the 2010s, the 2000s, and the 90s. I ranked all the Best Picture winners from those decades. We're going to continue on from the 80s. We're going to go all the way to the 40s, and then we're going to go into a acting category rankings, in which we'll talk about the Best Actor winners and rank them from the 2010s to the 70s, and then go through all the other acting races. And then next thing you know, we'll be back into the Oscar swing of things, where we're going to be predicting the Oscars. But right now, we're still early on in this series. So without further ado, let's jump into my ranking of the Best Picture winners from the 1980s, starting in chronological order with 1980, the winner, Ordinary People. And this is most known for a lot of people as not a movie on its own right, but a movie that beat out Raging Bull. Raging Bull being this all-time classic, probably should have won. I probably would have voted for it. I think it's an incredible movie, but it, Ordinary People instead beat it out. So I think because of that, a lot of people have this resentment towards Ordinary People. But on this channel, we don't talk about what should have won or what could have won. We just rank the movies themselves. And I actually think Ordinary People is a terrific movie. I think it's been unfairly maligned as the movie that beat out Raging Bull, because while I would have voted for Raging Bull myself, I think Ordinary People may have been my number 2. It's a terrific film. I think this is a secretly great piece of awkward cinema. I think Robert Redford really understands how he can really allow for longer takes and just hold editing choices to move to the next scene, just for a beat, to allow that some certain awkwardness to build up. Of course, this movie about sort of general malaise and unsureness and emotional repression after the death of a son, and sort of inability to connect with mother figures or fathers in our lives, in which the movie is mostly about, at least in my interpretation, situated through this idea that a son can't connect with his mother, but really a son finding his relationship with his father, and that sort of really Donald Sutherland being the sort of main linchpin of the film. And I think because this is not a super visually in-your-face movie, it allows performances to really stand out and convey that sort of emotional pressure that we see in the film. And it's an interesting movie for the 80s, in which this idea of therapy wasn't a totally popular thing. And even just the way it talks about mental health and illness, and really just talks about feelings and emotions in the forefront, it feels like a modern day movie. It's a movie that's aged quite well because of that. And I do think Redford understands material really well. He stays back, he doesn't do things too flashy, allows the performances and the actors to really bring a lot to the film, and then also with subtle sort of camera placements and framing and particularly editing choices to allow that sort of tension and that awkwardness, and what is not being said is actually being said even clearer by just allowing these scenes to play out and be a little bit slower in its pace. So I think it's a movie that's been overshadowed by Raging Bull, but I still think it's an excellent movie, a modern day feeling movie. So I'm going to put this one in the A category. 1981 now, Chariots of Fire, which is a movie that I understood as the parody before its actual movie. I had understood it as the sort of traditional running slow motion with that Vangelis score in the background. I've seen it parodied a million times before I'd actually seen the movie, and I think a lot of people, even modern day viewers, are in that similar boat. So I went back and saw the movie in preparation for this video because I hadn't seen it, and it's for the most part fine. I wasn't totally blown away by it. What I think it really captures well is I think it's a beautifully shot movie. It's incredibly framed, and I think the sequences of the running, the sort of poetic, abstract montage, inserts of feet, legs, human bodies running side by side, the inserts of the faces. It's this sort of abstract, almost montage sequences that they use, and those running sequences are really thrilling, really intense. But we have to remember that this is also early on in the sort of sports movie kind of a mold, where nowadays we have the Disney sports movie kind of a formula, and it's been created a formula, and you can replicate it, and it's pretty effective at that. But this movie struggles because it doesn't have that formula in which it really understands the racing sequences and how thrilling and exciting that is. But I think some of the subplots and the stuff in between those sequences, they don't necessarily clearly communicate the stakes of the overall event. And because you have all these different types of characters, it lacks the sort of singular central main protagonist that I think works for a sports movie. So they didn't really figure out the sort of in-between stuff as well. So it's aged a little bit because of that. So it's a solid movie with some really beautiful photography. But I think for the most part, the sort of parody of the running in the slow motion and the Vangelis score, that's the best part of the movie. That's the thing you should remember about it. So this one's going to go into the C tier. 1982, the winner was Gandhi, which is telling of the sort of types of Best Picture winners of this decade. Where the 90s, when I was doing the video, you start to learn and go, oh wow, this really was the decade of the actor turned director epic kind of a movie. But this didn't happen yet exactly. We had Robert Redford, but for the most part, I'd say the 80s is the historical epic. The 3-hour epic of some sort of big historical figure. Even in a movie like Reds, which didn't win, is in that similar mold, but of course, Last Emperor and Out of Africa, and then of course, Gandhi here. But I actually think Gandhi's one of the better versions of that. And it's in part because of its editing and that central lead performance of Ben Kingsley. First of all, the editing, I think, because you have this real true cradle to death kind of a movie where we see a lot of Gandhi's life, it's able to pick out the certain moments of his life that are sort of the most important and keep the movie going along and the story sort of moving forward. So it has sort of actually, despite being a 3-hour long movie, I felt pretty well paced and pretty energetic in its editing style, just because it has to, chronicle so much of this man's life that it does have this sort of quick and rapid pace. I also think there's some terrific editing in the choices to have these real contrasts where we have the sort of violence and the intensity and the mass swarm of the revolution that was necessary for the revolution and the sort of separation of India and England, with the sort of contrast that with the quietness of Gandhi and how he lived his life and his home life. So we often have these sort of distinct, sharp, jump cut almost or smash cut kind of situations, which is noticeable editing, but I think communicates the ideas very well. So that combined with sort of the quick pace of the editing, I found to be successful in making this movie age very well. And then of course that big other factor is Ben Kingsley, who maybe wouldn't be cast today. They maybe have cast an Indian actor, born and raised, but that would still be discrediting the amazing performance that Ben Kingsley did give in this film, in which he's convincing as a young man all the way until the old, wise, spiritual, revolutionary type political leader that Gandhi was. But that's what he's able to do as well, is that because the movie is so central through his viewpoint, we see him as more of a human. Now, he doesn't look at all of his faults. Gandhi is a man with faults, but it is a movie that still looks at sometimes his mistakes and his certain issues that he has and mistakes that he makes within the revolution. He's not just this idealized version. He does feel a little bit more human, but he still has that sort of central, strong moral core of nonviolence and peace that helps guide the separation from India and Britain, and then the partition later on. So an epic that is solid, if a little bit traditional, but helmed really well by a solid Ben Kingsley performance. So it's going to go into the B tier for me. In terms of endearment, 1983 was a movie I saw a few years back, and I was surprised the first time that it's not the sort of movie that it's billed as. It's really something else. And I remember liking it, but maybe not loving it. And then, so it was interesting to see, knowing what I knew on the rewatch this time around in preparation for this video, what my thoughts were. And I was really impressed again by the film. It really isn't this sort of sick cancer movie that you think it is. I think a lot of people heard that and they don't want to think of this as, oh, this is a 2-hour cancer movie, because it's not. You don't really get the cancer stuff until an hour and a half into the movie. It's really a movie, I think, about a modern day American family, and it treats the sort of familial dynamic and the journey of a modern family unit in life in the same way The Last Emperor treats the downfall of the Chinese emperor. And the one description that I would use that I think makes the most sense for this film is that it is so well observed. It's an incredibly well observed, realized film in just its depiction of everyday life. But because it spans decades, it has to take these certain moments, these silhouettes of people's lives, to explain the larger sort of character and narrative arc of this story. And it does so with certain scenes that it picks out are instantly memorable. They feel like moments in your own life, and just the sort of specificity of some of the scenes allows us to really feel for these characters. It feels, whether it be the performances or the writing, it feels just like a regular family that we're getting a glimpse into. It doesn't feel staged or over the top. It's just so well observed. And I think that central conceit of having these two characters that are really tight together, tied at the hip, in the mother and daughter, and then they go separate ways, in which the first time in their life they're sort of apart from each other, and they really are apart from each other for a lot of the movie. And we see Deborah Winger and her character, and what she and all the exciting things that she does within her life, and then Shirley MacLaine and the Jack Nicholson character, who I think is really deceivingly terrific in this film. I know he won the Oscar, but he is a lot better that you remember, or different than you think. Just his character arc I thought was really well done, but just having that sort of dueling narratives of these two characters that are so tight together, that separate and have their own lives and their new sort of sexual reawakenings, but then also still call each other and still have that connection. It's just it's a movie that I think it will only rise in my estimation. But right now I'm going to put it into the A tier. It's almost in the S tier. It's definitely a high S tier. Just a special movie, a warm, sweet movie, and just perfectly calibrated and so well observed. The 1984 winner, Amadeus, which is one of the great movies of the 1980s, in my opinion. It's a movie that has a solid reputation, but I think it deserves an even better reputation. I really do put it up there with Raging Bull and Do the Right Thing and these sort of great movies of the 80s, because I think it's everything all at once. Because on one hand, it's a solid Mozart biopic. We understand his sort of life and him in this period of time and his genius, but it's interesting because it's also more than that. It's a movie about Mozart the man and the biopic, but because we have essentially the audience surrogate of F. Murray Abraham's Salieri, he serves as the, like I said, the audience surrogate. And what that does, it allows for us to have a viewpoint of Mozart the person, but also Mozart the icon. Because we're seeing him through Salieri's eyes, we see him as the genius, as the modern day interpretation of Mozart we get to see in the eyes through Salieri. So we get a biopic of Mozart himself, but we also get a biopic of what Mozart, the sort of icon and imagery is, rather than the man himself. So you get both. But then also, because it's in a way also a biopic about Salieri, we get a movie that's larger than Mozart, a movie that confronts themes of genius and God and the purpose of life. So it's incredible balancing act that Milos Forman's able to bring. He's able to have these sort of prim, proper society beauty, the cinematography and the production design of this era, but then also the modern day vulgarities of Amadeus really being the sort of child and stunted, childlike kind of a person who has this sort of vulgarities that we don't necessarily think of when we think of this era. So it's a funny movie, but it's also sort of a weighty faith kind of a movie as well. That's beautifully shot, super well realized in terms of its production design. Two sort of dueling central performances at the center. It's a movie that can have its cake and eat it too. It's an incredible balancing act by Milos Forman, and without a doubt in the S tier. Then the 85 winner, Out of Africa, is one of the few Best Picture winners that I don't totally understand why it won. A movie like Crash is a movie like I don't necessarily love, but I sort of understand why it won. There's a historical understanding that I can get, but Out of Africa never made sense to me because it's just sort of generic and boring. Even still, with maybe it's just my modern day Gen Z kind of a viewpoint, but the movie really does have sort of almost 3-hour glacial pace. The politics, the fact that you have this white woman coming to Africa and that's the story we're telling. It seems like an excuse just to shoot Africa rather than telling an African story. It's not a movie that would be made today. The performances are solid and the technical aspects are well done, but it just seems like an odd story to tell. And then even odder that the movie won Best Picture because it's just sort of this sort of slow-moving, uninteresting kind of a film. So it's a movie I never got. Maybe it's just my Gen Z brain. I wasn't able to connect with those themes. But to me, it's just a little bit too slow, a little bit too uninteresting. So it's going to go into the C tier. 1986, the winner is Platoon, and it is one of the defining Vietnam War movies, but I also think that this is the second era of the Vietnam War movie, because Vietnam ended in mid-70s, 75, 76, and then Apocalypse Now and The Deer Hunter are 78, 79, and they're the sort of two big Oscar type movies. Deer Hunter wins Best Picture, Apocalypse Now doesn't win Best Picture, but is a well-regarded movie. And those movies, in my opinion, are not necessarily Vietnam War movies, as they are just movies about war that are set during Vietnam. I mean, Apocalypse Now is based on Hearts of Darkness, which is a Joseph Conrad novel that was written in 1899. So they're less so about Vietnam and more so about war, but set during the Vietnam War, because that was the most recent war. Whereas I think Platoon and Born on the 4th of July and the Stone movies are movies actually about the Vietnam War. I think there's a distinction there. I think Platoon seems weird. Why is this Vietnam War movie winning 8 years after 78, in which The Deer Hunter won? You know, wasn't that the Vietnam War movie that's defining of that decade? Yes, but also I think Platoon is actually the movie that's about Vietnam. It's about the drugs that were going on that wasn't really talked about in those movies. It was about the music. It was about the fact that it was a bunch of poor people from America that were getting drafted, not so the rich people, the fact that no one really wanted to be there was no sense of honor, the sort of loss of innocence that a lot of people had, the fact that they were young boys, a lot of them, and this was all well realized because Oliver Stone went to Vietnam, so he's able to add that specificity. I think a lot of people appreciate, because it was really the truth of Vietnam, rather than a well-made movie set during Vietnam, and I think it's really well apt at capturing those details, and still is a great sort of document and understanding what the Vietnam War really was in a sort of singular film, in a way that you could do that, and the sort of psychedelic almost feeling of you don't know where you are and you're in a different country and it's hot and you're just not supposed to be here. Everything's screaming, you're not supposed to be here. And I think Robert Richardson, this is maybe his best shot film. The use of green and the heat that he's able to sort of convey to the audience is so stunning. And then, you know, the choice in general just to have some of the handheld cameras and these tight close-ups and the background sort of fading away within the protagonist and within the frame, isolating them from the background, is a really smart choice to create that sort of disassociative feeling that I think a lot of the Vietnam vets now, but when they went to Vietnam at the time, a lot of those soldiers felt. So a great movie that helped document and define the Vietnam War and what it really was, and still an entertaining, tense, heartbreaking movie. It's not necessarily an easy watch, but it's a definitely well-made film, so it's going to go into the A tier. The Last Emperor, 1987, another historical epic, but similarly to, I would say, Out of Africa, it's a movie that has this beautiful setting and well shot, but in a way is sort of cultural tourism, because that central character I don't really feel much for. Where we're talking about Out of Africa, it's like this white woman, she goes to Africa, and a lot of people hadn't been to Africa, so they love seeing it on the film. They voted for Best Picture. I think The Last Emperor had a similar thing, but for China, where it's so beautifully well realized. And the movie makes an interesting choice in which, you know, I don't know too much about the fall of the Chinese Empire, so I was actually looking to learn a little bit from the film. The film isn't interested in telling you anything about it. It's just interested in seeing the fall through the eyes of the emperor as this young boy. But because we spend so much of the time of the movie with him as a young boy, I found it hard to emotionally resonate and connect to the character and to understand sort of his fall and his hubris. So I'm looking at a movie and it's a beautiful screensaver, but I was unable to emotionally connect with the film, so it just sort of struggled for me. And because I've seen, you know, I can go on YouTube and see videos of China now, that sort of cultural tourism that happened within the 80s that was maybe well appreciated doesn't really work as well here for me. So it felt a little bit empty, it felt a little bit cold. So it's just going to be a movie like Out of Africa that's just going to go into the C tier that I think is going to be a little bit forgettable. 1988, Rain Man, which is a movie that's the opposite of The Last Emperor, where The Last Emperor is a technical kind of a movie. Rain Man is all about above-the-line stuff. Great script, great acting, fun. Technical aspects are there to serve the story, but aren't necessarily there to, you know, be so in your face. And generally, I like those kinds of movies. Obviously, you kind of want both great technical stuff and great script and acting and everything. But, you know, there is a sort of, every year in the Oscars we see the sort of technical type movie and then the performance-based movie. And Rain Man definitely is this performance-based movie. And it's a movie that I don't think even would have been nominated today, because it's just a traditional sort of 80s road trip movie, and a really great one at that. So I am glad that when I look back and I go, oh yeah, Rain Man did win Best Picture. That's a fun win, because it's just an 80s buddy road trip kind of movie, and those are some of my favorites, and they very rarely get recognized by the Oscars. And the two performances at the center really are the strength of the film. That Dustin Hoffman playing someone that's, a neurotypical person probably wouldn't play today. They probably would get, a real autistic actor to do, but I think at the time was sort of revolutionary and groundbreaking. So, just depicting this kind of a character on screen. So I thought, that was notable for that regard. But even still, from a modern day viewpoint, I think he's a very funny character and a very charming character, and he's fun to be around. And then I think Tom Cruise is a secret anchor of the film, because he does sort of straight man thing with such ease and natural charisma. I mean, because he's a really big jerk. You're not supposed to like this guy. Everything on the script makes it super difficult for Tom Cruise to overcome that fact that he's really kind of a jerk, this guy. And yet, Cruise's charm and charisma and movie star ability surpasses all of that. So by the end of it, you really understand, I think, the humor, which a lot of it comes from Dustin Hoffman's character, but then Tom Cruise, which allows the emotional weight of the film to really be hammered home. And for him to overcome all these, bad things that he does, we still like Tom Cruise as a character at the end, because he's a great movie star. And then the chemistry, of course, that sort of Abbott and Costello back and forth, is the reason why the film is so successful. So just a great movie, an easy movie to watch, great road trip movie. So I'm going to put this one in the A tier. And then finally, Driving Miss Daisy, a sort of odd, slight Sunday afternoon movie. It's kind of forgettable and has regressive politics, and it seems like a weird movie that would win Best Picture, because it is kind of just like a slight, you see it once, you kind of forget it kind of a movie. But I guess there wasn't really any sort of clear winner for that year. I mean, Do the Right Thing was probably the clear winner, but it didn't win. And that's kind of the interpretation of Driving Miss Daisy. And still today, it feels old-fashioned for a movie that was released in 89, almost the 90s. It feels very old-fashioned. So it's a fine movie, but just the way that it's aged and structured, it's weird that this sort of 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10, okay, kind of fine movie, won Best Picture. It hasn't aged super well, so kind of forgettable. So I'm going to put that one in the D tier. But that's about it. Here is the list in full. Take a look at it. Let me know your thoughts. We had a lot of A tiers, not a lot in the B. For the most part, it was like, yeah, it's fine, it's okay. And then certain stuff that I really like, with that Amadeus being into that special tier. I think that's a real special movie. With Terms of Endearment, maybe if I rethink about this list 5 years from now, maybe Terms of Endearment, it really impressed me on this rewatch, but I didn't want to go so crazy. But still, very high in the A tier. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below, let me know your rankings for the 80s, and stay tuned next week, where I'm going to be ranking arguably the best decade of American cinema, 1970s, ranking the Best Picture winners. Some of the greatest movies of all time won Best Picture in the 70s, so it's going to be a really tough video just to rank all of them, but it should be a lot of fun regardless. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.